So my journey on the fringes of rock and roll started with the band The Cars, some 12 years before I worked with Paul McCartney. And they had their own recording studio in Boston on Newbury Street, which is sort of like the Rodeo Drive of Boston. At least back then it was. Very expensive street. And my friend and I were film students, and my friend, I'm not going to name him, but he kind of wormed his way into Rick Ocasek's world and ultimately convinced him to finance a film that he and I were going to make, me and my friend would make. And after we shot it, they put us in their studio, in Synchro Sound, in the basement with an editing thing. You know, back then it was like a big, monstrous Steenbeck, they called it, you know. So we basically took over their lounge. But they would come in every once in a while, and Rick took sort of an interest in the editing process, and he would poke his head in occasionally. I was editing one time, and let me just tell you, he was not a friendly guy. If you read that book, Let the Stories Be Told, it's a very good book. If you're a Cars fan, you should read it. Rick could be very unpleasant. But one time I was alone in there editing, and he poked his head in, and he was actually being very kind of gregarious and nice, you know, and he started talking to me. I remember still, he was just standing in the doorway. I was at the thing a couple of feet away, and somehow I don't know how he got around to the point of talking about when they recorded their first record, which I reckon that would have been 1978, I suppose. They recorded at Air Studios, which is in London, and George Martin was owner, or at least part owner of it, and was there a lot. I think Roy Thomas Baker was their producer. Anyway, they're listening to the playback of Just What I Needed. And George Martin walks by, and the door was open, and he just sort of lingered outside the door, and they couldn't see him there. And when the song ends, he pokes his head in, and he says to Rick, he says, "You got a hit there. You got a hit record." And Rick told me, he said, we were like, "What the fuck? What do you know?" He said, "No, we didn't say, what do you know? We said, how do you know?" And then they said to themselves, "Oh, yeah, I know how he knows. He has a few under his belt himself." So, you know, that was one time Rick was kind of nice to me and told me something. But for any Cars fans out there, you know, because, you know, we were ensconced, is that the word? We were ensconced in their studio, Synchro Sound, for months editing the film. Nowadays, you can edit a movie in a couple of weeks, but back then, and this was a short film, it was called Chapter X. It was 30 minutes, but it took us months and months and months to edit it. And the Cars contributed music. Rick gave music to it. Greg Hawkes gave music to it, and David Robinson gave music to it. But the thing I was going to tell you is that, you know, I got to know them all fairly well to varying degrees. I'd say I knew David Robinson the best, and he was the nicest guy in the band. And Greg, I knew pretty well as well, Greg Hawkes, and he was very nice as well. Maybe just a little bit more removed. David was just a regular guy, you know. And then Elliot Easton, you know, he knew he was a rock star. So he was a little bit more, you know, aloof, but still nice, you know, polite and everything. And then you got Ben Orr, and fuck if he didn't know he was a rock star. So in essence, you know, you never saw the guy. He very rarely came into the studio. And then you had Rick, a real son of a gun, if you ever saw one, of an unpleasant fella. You know, he cut Paulina out of his will when he died, so that'll tell you something about him. But every once in a while, he could be a nice, warm guy. You know, he was just a very moody person with mood swings. Anyway, that record, you could argue, I'm not in an arguing mood here, but, you know, it could be said that it's like the greatest rock debut album of all time. Well, let's just say one of them. Of course, the Beatles' first album, Talking Heads 77, Stooges album, if you go that route, you know, if you like that kind of stuff. Roxy Music's first record. But the Cars was way up there. It was just like every song was a gem. In fact, Elliot Easton said they used to joke, instead of calling it the Cars, They should have called it the Cars' Greatest Hits. Their first record is already a greatest hits album. But it's pretty true if you think about it. Anyway, in conclusion, you know that famous scene in that film Fast Times at Ridgemont High, where what's-her-name there gets out of the pool, Phoebe Cates there, and takes her top off there. And they use a Cars song, Moving in Stereo. And, if you watch that scene, I think it's pretty clear that they chose that song merely for its title, given what's going on.